Hello, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by the brilliant Marc Owen Jones, who is Associate Professor of Middle East Studies, the author of Digital Authoritarianism in the Middle East and Political Repression in Bahrain. Also, just confuse everyone, we do obviously have remarkably similar names. We're not as far as I know, related. I'm sure if you go back long enough in Welsh history, there is maybe some, who knows, some familial ties. Who's to know?
Right. Son of John, that's what Jones means. So John got around.
John. Yeah, it's not the rarest name in Wales, to be fair.
True.
I'm delighted to talk to you today, particularly about misinformation in the horror show, which is, of course, the onslaught against Gaza. And I have to say, look, every wartime propaganda, as long as there's been war, there has been wartime propaganda. But obviously, the nature of the digital revolution means there's far more, I suppose, avenues now for that. And I suppose the Israeli state has a very sophisticated propaganda machine. So I just want to start. One of the things you look at is about the issue of what's called disinfluencers, which I'm very fascinated with. What the hell is a disinfluencer and what's their role in the current horror?
Well, the term disinfluencer is something I came up with because of my research. What I've noticed is essentially it's someone who routinely spreads disinformation, right? Disinformation and influencer, combine them, you've got disinfluencer. And the reason I use that term is because I've noticed that there's people essentially who routinely spread fake news. And that can be the official Israel account linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or it can be others who seem to be spreading pro-Israel propaganda in this case, or any other form of propaganda or disinformation, for reasons that seem suspicious. And by that, I mean they crop up every now and then to, share an absolute whopper. So just to give an example, which I think is always useful, one of the strategies that Israel has always used is to initially attribute anything to Hamas or Palestinian. We all remember the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh last year. Initially, the strategy was to say, oh, we didn't do it, or if it was a Palestinian gunman.
It was the Al Jazeera journalist, for those who don't remember.
Yes, an Al Jazeera journalist. And it was later found that the Israeli soldiers actually had shot her, right, despite attempts to cover it up. And disinfluencers in this day and age will do something similar, right? So I've seen a bunch of these tweeting and writing about what's going on in Gaza. Amjad Taha is one of them. He's a famous disinfluencer. He's spread many fake stories in the past, but what really caught my attention recently, for example, there was a video that was circulated a few weeks ago, showed some people cycling around dead bodies on a road. It had very clearly been the result of an Israel airstrike or artillery attack. And without waiting a second, he basically claimed it was Hamas snipers. No evidence to back that up. It got thousands and thousands of shares, millions of views and shares. And it then got picked up by legacy outlets, right? Like the New York Post. They used him as a source for the story to say that Hamas snipers were shooting Palestinian civilians. But he has no credibility. In fact, I've looked at this guy for 3 years and he spreads fake stories, like, for example, saying that, Qatar bribed Ecuador to lose the opening game of the World Cup, right? Ecuador won, by the way. And so this is a good example of a disinfluencer. But we're also seeing the emergence of, Hasbara accounts. These are people who engage in pro-Israel propaganda. But also, I would argue that the official state accounts of Israel, accounts like Israel on X, which is linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are disinfluencers because they routinely share fake news. And this, when it happens so often, we can't say it's an accident anymore, which is why I say dis, because dis means deliberately sharing false news, as opposed to mis, which means accidentally sharing false news. I no longer believe that these actors are acting in good faith and sharing news that's false just by accident, because they do it so often.
So, you've alluded there. One of the key roles of disinfluencers in this particular conflict is there's a recognition that there was a colossal death toll, which is obviously having an impact on Western public opinion. So it's to spread the idea that what you're seeing is not the product of Israeli military action, but either, you just give an example, it's actually Hamas, or, for example, a recent is, what keeps recurring, is of babies who parents are grieving over are actually dolls, or indeed there was a use of one clip, for example, of it turned out to be a Thai toddler at Halloween from 2021, and they claimed that this moving supposed body wrapped up in a kind of corpse costume was actually a Palestinian child pretending to be dead. So, that's a kind of example, isn't it? It's to kind of go, these aren't really dead people, they're not really dying, and they spread that online to sow doubt.
Yeah, That's an example of crisis actors, right? And we've seen this trope in Russia, Ukraine. By crisis actors, we're talking about the term actor, someone who in theory is paid or faking injury. And again, you mentioned those two examples, but the most, I think, prominent one is the one shared by the Israel account a few weeks ago of a baby that claimed it was a doll wrapped in a shroud. And it was a real, actually it wasn't, it was a real baby who'd been killed and was being held by a grieving relative. And not only that, this has happened it happened a few days ago. The same thing. Accounts claiming that the Palestinians were using babies that were dolls to evoke sympathy, again, to cast doubt on the narrative that there'd been so many Palestinian losses. And let's fuse this into a larger narrative, a meta-narrative, which is, casting doubt on Palestinians generally. What did Joe Biden do about a month ago? He basically kind of repeated this narrative that Palestinian death figures or Hamas death figures were not to be trusted, even though a number of organizations have spoken out, from Human Rights Watch to others, saying that Palestinian death figures at Ministry of Health have historically been reliable. So there is a clear narrative that seeks to cast doubt on the huge volume of innocent Palestinian civilians dying, and that ties in with Israeli propaganda, which obviously tries to seek to minimize their perceived brutality, right? Because obviously that will push public opinion against Israel, and public opinion is clearly moving against Israel, and they are getting a little desperate, which is why they resort to these ridiculous narratives and lies, which are fundamentally also dehumanizing. To lie and to claim that someone who's just lost their child is using a doll is dehumanizing, right? You're calling that person a liar at perhaps the most saddest or tragic time of their life.
Yeah, and it's the idea that Palestinians are so depraved that they will pretend to grieve over their dead children who aren't actually dead children; they're actually dolls. That's how depraved.
Well, it's an Orientalist trope, right? It's the barbarian other, it's the barbarian Easterner, the uncivilized Easterner who will lie to gain sympathy. It's the duplicitous Arab, right? It's tying into all these narratives, about people from the East being somehow deviant, and it's super problematic, but it's being weaponized on a huge scale right now.
There's another example which has as a crisis actor, and this is a Palestinian vlogger who frequently, I follow him myself on Twitter, people may see him out and about, and there's a meme that goes around which shows him in various situations as singer. He does actually sing. I've seen his video. He's actually quite a good singer, to be honest. But then it goes through various, like war correspondent, and then it will show him pretending supposedly to be a wounded patient, which shows he was just pretending, and that wasn't actually a wounded patient at all. It was this crisis actor. And there was another example I can't remember of him in that scenario. But he isn't a crisis actor, is he? And that wasn't actually him. And that meme, by the way, was shared by a senior broadcast journalist here in Britain, who I won't name because I've got enough on my plate, to be honest. But what do you tell me about that example?
I mean, I think those examples are, it's like, official Israel accounts have shared examples of people saying that they are injured, Palestinians faking injuries that are actually screenshots from films, behind the scenes of films, right? So people are taking content, they're decontextualizing and reappropriating it to form propaganda. And it's crude and it seems stupid. But at the end of the day, like the secret with disinformation is not necessarily the quality. It's about putting out false information quickly and at scale. And then you can fool people into believing those things.
And just so people know, the vlogger I referred to, what they did is they got a Palestinian 15-year-old who was attacked last year in a refugee camp. It wasn't him at all. And they made it so it was actually him when it wasn't. You've also raised this example of them using fake nurses. Tell me about this. What are we talking about here?
Well, one of the muddy areas here of disinformation propaganda, it's not always clear who's behind it, who's making it. But at the same time, what's important is we can see who is sharing it, right? The example of my fake nurse has become legendary, right? It was about 2 weeks ago. And the reason the nurse was relevant is because one of the focal points of this war has been hospitals, because Israel have been attacking hospitals, including a Shifa medical complex, right? And one of the arguments Israel always use is that Hamas are using these hospitals as bases and operating centers. They dig tunnels underneath it, and they're using patients as human shields, right? And so what Israel have tried to do is try to spend time legitimizing their attacks on hospitals, which have resulted in hundreds of deaths. So the nurse it's popped up online, a TikTok video of someone who claimed to be a Palestinian nurse working Al Shifa, filming herself, a selfie video, saying, "Oh, you know, I'm basically Hamas are awful. They're using people as human shields. They're not letting us leave, right?" And it was just, I mean, it was ridiculous. Firstly, she had immaculate makeup in a war zone. She had like a very strategically placed Palestinian Ministry of Health sign behind her. She was wearing kind of an immaculate coat, which, you know, after the horrors we've seen coming out of the hospital, is very implausible. The audio sounded fake, and crucially, her accent was terrible. She didn't speak Arabic. She wasn't a native speaker. And this video was then shared by the official Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs camp in Arabic, and it was shared by hundreds of other influencers and got millions of views, right? The whole point of this video was very simple. It was trying to say, I'm an insider, I'm a Palestinian, and I also oppose Hamas. I agree with the Israeli narrative that Hamas are using this hospital. It was soon deleted because everyone was just taking the piss out of it because it was so obviously fake.
It was ludicrous. It was ludicrous.
It was ludicrous, right? But it was being shared as if it were real by official accounts, right? So this is a classic attempt of someone, we don't necessarily know the source of that propaganda or that disinformation, of course, or deception. I mean, it was many different things in addition to being propaganda, but it was concocted. And again, it was purely an attempt to try and legitimize Israeli attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure and hospitals by faking an insider, right? And again, how many people saw this video and actually thought it was true before it was deleted and debunked? I like to think in this case, maybe not many believed it was true, even the most ardent.
I saw people believing it.
Yeah, I did at the time. I just, you know, I need some faith in humanity to believe that people aren't necessarily stupid.
The soundtrack itself of the bombs was so ludicrous. You'd hope so. Yeah. Just two other things, just in terms of the Western media. And how Palestinian suffering is marginalized through selection bias. Just to explain, what do you mean by that? Because I know that's a theme of yours.
Yeah, so I mean, we have a war here. We have a historic, war. We've have a situation where this occupation, apartheid, is never contextualized. In fact, it's become taboo to contextualize it. You can't almost say that it didn't start on October the 7th, because if you say it starts on October the 7th, then that acknowledges that you blaming everything on Hamas, which is unreasonable. You need to look at the whole context of history here. But that's one aspect of how this conflict is framed. But the thing I think is really important is we've seen such a huge scale of Palestinian deaths, right? Verging on what the former ICC prosecutor Lou Ocampo calls genocide, right? And many people are calling it genocide or genocidal because it is. And so you have a situation where you have what is being described as genocide, yet you also have a situation where the number of people being killed is being omitted, or at least completely made invisible in mainstream media. So I did a study early on in this after about 14 days of coverage, for example, in the Daily Mail, which many people know as a sort of right-leaning British newspaper that's widely read. And on the front pages of the first 2 weeks of this conflict, they did not mention the cumulative total of Palestinians killed, which is already reaching into the thousands. Not one day. And they mentioned, for example, the number of Israelis who were killed about 4 or 5 times on the front pages, right? And I know it's a right-wing paper, but to me, that's a really, really potent example of marginalization of Palestinian suffering, not wanting to give people the full scale of the impact of Israeli bombing on Palestine. And I think that is really key, because remember, some people have said before that omission is one of the most virulent forms of censorship. If you don't show something that is really crucial, and the amount of Palestinians killed here is so crucial, then you're engaging in some form of either censorship or certainly propaganda and deception, I would say, because you're not giving people readily the full facts that are relevant for them to make an informed understanding of what's going on now in Gaza and Israel.
The other thing I know you've been speaking about is fear-mongering, disinformation used to undermine solidarity with Palestinian activists. What do you mean by that?
So this is really an interesting one, right? One of the most crucial things to sustain, I think, the Israeli bombing campaign is the notion that they get not unconditional Western support, but they've had certainly very clear support from the US and UK and places like Germany. So what's really important about this is the way that you counter that support is to have activists and people mobilize in places like the UK and the US to basically express that they are not happy with their country's support for what is genocide, right? So, Israel knows this. And so what do? Well, you have to try and undermine solidarity movements abroad, because those solidarity movements can change public opinion, put pressure on the governments to withdraw their support for Israel. And that's what's happening. And there's some really interesting things going on. So very early on in this war, in October, I, for example, would see a video someone would share this video of a car doing donuts in a freeway in the US, right? Bear with me, it sounds strange. Getting millions of engagements saying, hey, look, these yobs, Palestinian terrorists, waving the Palestinian flag, are here spreading their kind of agenda and ideology, right? Essentially trying to get people in the US who are reading this content to sort of say, oh my God, these Palestinians are Muslim terrorists and they're going to come and get us. Look at the video, pause it, zoom in. It's not even a Palestinian flag. It's a Cuban flag. And the funny thing about that particular incident, and again, which went viral, is that there was a CBS journalist stuck in the traffic a few cars behind. And so I remember reached out to him along with another people and go, hey, was this a Palestinian flag? And he's like, no, it was nothing to do with that, right? And so that was one example, but there's some more potent examples. And I mean, I won't go into the details about what's going on in college campuses in the US, but something came to light recently that was really alarming, which is, again, and college campuses are an important site of solidarity movements with Palestine. So trying to smear pro-Palestinian activists is a way of trying to spread fear and try to remove support from those movements. There was a case in the University of British Columbia in Canada where someone had been sticking I love Hamas stickers around, right? And this was obviously used as an opportunity to say that pro-Palestinian activists support Hamas and terrorism, and that this was creating conditions that were making Jewish students fearful for their safety, right? And you can understand, if that was true, why that would be the case. However, it turned out that the person putting those stickers was a contractor for Hillel, which is a organization set up to, to promote Jewish life on campus. And it's been accused by some of being a Zionist organization. So you have a contractor working for a Zionist organization, basically spreading I love Hamas stickers around campus to create an atmosphere of fear and distrust and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Now, that level of deception is really akin to an influence operation. Someone trying to create division amongst activists in the UK and the US, and the US in this case, and Canada, in order to undermine the solidarity movement that would put pressure on its government to try and end their support for the ongoing genocide in Israel, Gaza, by Israel.
Just very lastly, because we covered so much with your incredible expertise. I mean, maybe this is just hard. I mean, it's kind of speculative. It's just whenever I tweet about lots of things, get bombarded by people going, screaming all sorts of gibberish. But it's never been so striking to me that when I tweet something about Israel/Gaza, I will immediately be bombarded with accounts which aren't following me, but they're clearly my tweets because they'll respond often immediately. And they're anonymous. They've often joined recently, but you go through their tweets, it's just them responding about just talking about Israel, Gaza, and spreading certain narratives and claims which are obviously supportive of what Israel's doing. Is that a troll farm, basically? And is it just impossible to prove that?
It's very hard to prove that, but from what we know about how Hasbara 2.0 operate, we know, for example, that in previous bombing campaigns of Gaza, they have crisis kind of teams on university campuses in Israel where people will all go to a room and engage in explaining, where they will confront people who are seen as pro-Palestinian or critical of Israel to try and, tell them the truth. And that will also involve and can involve attacking those people, right? So if you have suddenly loads of people who are told to do that, it involves setting up new accounts. That is a nature of coordinated, I would say, inauthentic behavior, even if it's real. But at the same time, we know, and I know from how X is operating now, that the prevalence of bots and fake accounts is huge. And the chances are in any war, in any conflict situation, any regime will resort to using fake accounts and bots to try and intimidate and target key opinion formers who are deemed to be influential voices with harassment. So I would say it's almost 99% sure that there are troll farms operating and that they're attacking you. Some of those will be real people too, who have just got off a pseudonym and want to attack you. But there's no doubt in my mind that there will be. In fact, there is an Israeli company called Team Jorge who sell a software called AIMS, and this whole software is basically an interface with loads of avatars, so fake accounts, on multiple platforms from LinkedIn to Twitter to Facebook X, who even have crypto accounts. And the whole point of these accounts is to create an illusion of real people who engage with other people online. You have a software like this as a single operative, and especially now with AI and ChatGPT, you could basically have an army of people at your disposal who could do what you want, whether it's just try and change a narrative subtly or attack people, right? And we know that Israel has these capabilities because people who previously worked for their intelligence service are selling this product to foreign governments. So, I have no doubt that this is being deployed now. I mean, why wouldn't it be? it's being treated as Israel's 9/11. Of course, it's going to be used.
Mark, that was a tour de force. We covered so much. And I think this is just an insight into the brilliant work that Marc does on this issue. So do follow him at Marc with a C, Owen Jones on Twitter. And do read his work. I'll publish on Al Jazeera and all sorts of different platforms. But all the way through this has been, for me, crucial in terms of looking at the misinformation that has been spread in this war. And this is so important because it is about life or death. That's what misinformation in war boils down to. So, Marc, thank you so much for your work. Please like and subscribe and share this video. But a huge thanks to Marc and his amazing work.
Thank you.